Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm a specialist in the Old Norse language and a historical linguist, and I've been teaching at various universities in the United States for 10 years, most recently at the University of California, Berkeley, where I teach at present, and for several years at the University of California, Los Angeles. I speak on YouTube about subjects within my field of expertise, including Old Norse language and myth, and today I want to discuss the timeline of Old Norse and its predecessor and successor languages, as well as the alphabets used to write Old Norse, because there's a fair amount of confusion out there about this. It's easy to kind of lose track of what something like Old Norse means versus Proto Norse if you don't have a clear timeline to work with. So what I've done on the board here is on the far left, I have years. This is 2000 AD or CE, 1000 year zero, and then 1000 BC, 2000, 3000, 4000 BC. I have then extinct languages marked in red, and at the top I have some abbreviated modern languages written in blue. And then on the side I have some alphabets indicated in a rufus color, and I'll come back to that in a minute when I get to the later languages that start to be written down in this process. So I have a previous video about the Indo-European languages that gives a very brief overview of what these languages are and their relative position on the family tree. But Proto-Indo-European would have been spoken, there's a lot of disagreement about this. Some people say about 3000 BC, some people say about 4000 BC. Here I'm just kind of conservatively say about 4000 BC. And Proto-Indo-European splinters off over the next centuries from being a cohesive language to having several different dialect groups that will eventually become most of the languages of Europe and India today. So some of the earliest languages that are written down and that are well known to people include Sanskrit in India, Greek in Greece, and Latin in Italy, and later the whole Roman Empire. But not written down for some time is the branch of the Indo-European languages that will become the Germanic languages, including Scandinavian, English, and German today. A Proto-Germanic stage is postulated as a period when the Germanic languages were all still one unified language, probably with some dialect differences. And although this language is only sort of written down in some of the very oldest runic inscriptions, we can fairly reasonably date it to probably about the year zero, about the last point where the Germanic languages could be spoken of as a single language. Now from that unified period, we go forward a few centuries and we start finding our first inscriptions in the Elder Futhark. Now, I have a video about the origin of the Elder Futhark, which I'll link in an annotation and in the description below. But in short, the Elder Futhark is first attested. We have our first remains of things written in the Elder Futhark from about 150 or 160 AD. That does not mean that that's when that alphabet was first used. It's very unlikely that we have the very first thing ever written in this alphabet. And in fact, it does show by certain features of the way that it writes vowels, for instance, that it was probably designed for a slightly earlier stage even of the language than the earliest items that we have written in it. So we might date that to about the year 02, although I wouldn't be surprised the Elder Futhark is actually somewhat older than that. But I'm trying to be sort of conservative here. So in the next few centuries, we have some inscriptions written in Elder Futhark that we can call late Proto-Germanic or perhaps early Proto Norse. We also have some inscriptions in early Gothic and in ancestors of English and German and Frisian, etc. too. So the Gothic language splits off, and we have the first really long cohesive records of a Germanic language written in Gothic from about 300, when the Bishop Wulfila translated the New Testament and at least part of the Old Testament into Gothic. But Gothic is now extinct, although Gothic provides us with a lot of information about the earlier stages of Germanic languages and gives us a lot more information about Proto-Germanic than we would have from the other Germanic languages, which are preserved later and so have lost a lot of older features. The West Germanic languages and the North Germanic languages probably split a little bit later than Gothic splits off. And so I'm representing that by this little split right here. And since I only have so much room on this small board in my office, I haven't shown all of the Germanic languages, but I've shown English as a representative of the West Germanic languages. English is called Old English from the time of the earliest writings in the Roman alphabet, somewhere around 700 AD. English also has a distinct middle stage called Middle English from about the Norman Conquest in 1066 till about the beginning of printing in the 1400s. And since the 1400s, we call the language Modern English. Now, English is also written in runes in our earliest records of it. And the runic alphabet used to write Old English is a separate development from runes in Scandinavia. They both start with the Elder Futhark, but the so-called Anglo-Frisian Futhark that's used to write Old English is quite different from the younger Futhark used to write Old Norse. So speaking of that, after the West Scandinavian languages, the West Germanic languages like English, German, Dutch, Frisian have split off from the Scandinavian languages. The Scandinavian languages continue to have a period of common development that we can call Proto Norse, or sometimes it's called Proto-Scandinavian. During this period, by about the year 700, all of the Scandinavian languages, or North Germanic languages as they're sometimes called, undergo an extreme change in their vowel system. The effects of what is called umlaut, which is a process where vowels influence one another in a word and then drop out. So we get much shorter words and a much larger inventory of vowels in the language about this time. We also see in Scandinavia writing switch from the Elder Futhark to the younger Futhark, which takes the 24-letter alphabet of the Elder Futhark and reduces it to 16 letters. It's a little strange that the alphabet actually loses letters when the language is gaining vowels, but such is the way of things. So by about 700, we can actually begin to speak of it not as Proto Norse anymore because the language has undergone such drastic change. We can start calling this early Old Norse or Viking Age Old Norse or Archaic Old Norse. There's various ways of talking about it. And late in the Viking Age, perhaps around the year, late in the 900s or by 1000, there's a distinct split between Eastern and Western Scandinavian languages. So by the time that there's writing in the Roman alphabet by the 1100s in most of the Scandinavian countries, the vernacular, the everyday language that we see written there can be called Old East Norse for the Swedes, the Danes, and often it's called Old West Norse for the ancestor of Norwegian, Icelandic, and Faroese, which was still cohesive in the early part of this last millennium, from about 1000 to about 1380, or about the Black Death. When you learn Old Norse from a textbook or from a series of YouTube videos like I began some months ago, what you're learning is this. It's Old West Norse as written in the Roman alphabet during approximately the 1200s or 1300s AD, which is when in Iceland many of the sagas as well as the Eddas, such as the Poetic Edda, which I've recently translated, were written down by probably by Icelandic clerics who were seeking to preserve the cultural memories and literature that was being slowly lost. Now, after this Old East Norse or Old West Norse period, especially after the Black Death, we see more division into the individual languages. Swedish and Danish become more distinct, and Norwegian, Faroese, and Icelandic become more distinct. Now today, Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian are mutually intelligible, which may be a little bit belied by the fact that Norwegian is sort of split off from Swedish and Danish here, but Norwegian has come under heavy influence from Danish, and the sheer proximity of the languages has turned Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish into kind of a dialect chain, so that basically languages from areas nearer to you in Scandinavia will sound more familiar, but the further away those languages are, regardless of national borders, they will sound more different. But with reasonable accommodations to one another, Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes can understand one another. Whereas Icelandic and Faroese are not mutually intelligible, although to an extent they're reasonably figure-outable in writing to one another, but the spoken languages are not mutually intelligible, and they're not mutually intelligible with any of the Scandinavian languages on the continent. One thing that I should mention here, just as an aside, that I've discussed in more detail in other videos, is that there really isn't a single living language that is most like Old Norse. That's not really a meaningful statement, because all languages change every generation. And Icelandic, even though its grammatical structure has certainly stayed very conservative and more like Old Norse than most other Scandinavian languages, its sounds have changed a great deal. I have a video about that I'll link in an annotation and in the video description below. But it also should be borne in mind that there are many dialects on the continent, such as Elfdalian in Sweden, the traditional dialects of Setesdal, Hallingdal, West Telemark, Sogn in Norway, that have more conservative features and are thus structurally, or even in terms of sounds, more like Old Norse than the surrounding dialects. But that doesn't really mean that any one dialect could be called something like living Old Norse, because all languages continue to change, and no one today speaks as a native language anything that's exactly like either what we call Old Norse typically, or like Viking era archaic Old Norse. From the University of California, Berkeley, let me wish you all the best.